G'day internet trendsetters. This video is about building my arcade machine. Built it from scratch and just making this video to see if I can help anyone else out that's interested in making their own. Step one is planning. Before you do anything, before you pick up a tool, buy a piece of material, do some planning and think of your requirements. I'm a software developer by day, so any project that we start, you have to start with requirements. What do you want? What are you looking to do? So obviously, one decision that people need to make is if you're going to use a LCD or a CRT. So a CRT is like an old TV to give that authentic look. I personally think LCDs look rubbish, so I knew I had to go with a CRT or an old TV of some description. The next thing I considered was the size. I wanted to make what was called a Bartop, which is sort of like a full cabinet but just chopped in half. Makes it a little bit more portable. I wanted to be able to maybe stick it in a van and take it around my mate's house, or move it around the place a bit easier than an enormous standing cabinet that needs 4 blokes to pick it up and move it. So another consideration that I wanted to run a computer inside. Some people use Raspberry Pis. That's cool. I just had an old computer lying around that I had acquired from somewhere. So I knew that I wanted to use a full-fledged desktop computer. Just depends what you got lying around. In terms of trying to build something like this, always consider what materials and what things you've got to save yourself from having to buy everything from scratch. You might be able to save some dollars if you've already got certain things that you can use. So in terms of purchasing the components that I needed to build the machine, a lot of the stuff I got from a website called ozstick.com.au, so it's for your Australian buyers basically. So the first thing off the rank was the iPack, which is basically just an interface board that'll interface your buttons and your joysticks and translate that into a keyboard press. The next thing that you probably need is an arcade VGA card that will plug into the desktop computer and translate the video signal from 30 odd kilohertz to 15 kilohertz. Now there's plenty of other ways to do it. This is just the way that I chose to do it because it's just a plug-in solution. But yeah, other keyboard warriors I'm sure will pipe up and say what's the cheaper and easier alternative. Because I was using that card was a video amplifier, and it's just a tiny little piece of electronics that upscales that voltage to a higher amount so that the CRT can receive the signal and be bright effectively. So of course you need buttons and you need joysticks, so whatever buttons you want to choose. There's plenty of different colours and plenty of different styles. There's backlit buttons, you name it. Player 1 and 2 buttons, there's quite a few varieties. I was going with a certain theme, so most of my buttons are just pretty standard dimple top buttons. I chose to go with a amplifier, like a tiny little amplifier that I bought off eBay. It was pretty good value for 15 bucks. And that was going to power some car speakers that I just had lying around. So being that I said I was going to choose a TV, I sort of was hunting around trying to find what TV I was going to use. And it turns out my old man had a 51 centimeter TAC TV sitting in his garage that hadn't been turned on since 2004 or something. So I was quite happy to snap that out of his garage, and he told me last time he plugged it in it was working sweet, so took his word for it. I knew where he lived. You can't use the TV electronics, you have to use what's called an arcade chassis. And I'm just going to give a disclaimer here that taking TVs apart is dangerous. It will kill you if you don't know what you're doing. Even if you think you know what you're doing, you'll still die. Get someone that knows what they're doing. If you're a bit of a risk taker, like I am, you can just probably YouTube how to discharge a tube. But yeah, I'm not going to tell you any more than that. Just know that you're dealing with some pretty serious voltages, pretty serious currents, and you'll get toasted. There's a really awesome dude, a well-known dude in my part of the world. I live in Perth, Western Australia. His name's Joe Mac, and he's a bit of a legend in the old arcade scene around these traps. He's very experienced with TV screens and arcade machines and all the electronics that goes with it. So basically, in order to use that TV tube, I had to find an arcade chassis that will basically turn that signal and receive an RGB signal from the computer. So what he does is he tells you to measure the resistance, measuring the resistance between the vertical and horizontal sync of the yoke, just counting the number of pins on the yoke, and you sort of give that info to him and he'll find you an arcade chassis that will plug in and be able to work with that tube. With him, he doesn't deal with anyone outside of Australia, so don't go email him because he'll probably just delete it. One little tip as well is do not find Sony Trinitrons because they're too much of a pain in the ass. They do their own thing and they're not standardized at all. Alright, so down to making the box. I chose to use MDF 12mm. I'm not a cabinet maker by any sense of the word. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. I find it quite easy to use. I used a jigsaw. Basically what I did, the technique I used was I had the TV split in half and I had a couple of bits of timber that I made up as sort of like a holding frame that was to go behind the TV bevel. And then I sort of laid the TV on its side and just cut out a bit of a shape as to how I thought the machine was going to look. Now obviously I didn't just go cutting straight away. I did so many measurements to start with. You know, you've got to consider the depth of your control panel, you've got to consider a whole bunch of stuff before you go making that cut. But just, that was the method I used, just laying the TV on the side, having it on the angle, and measuring out everything as best I could to think what would fit and where things would go. And then I cut both sides. I chose not to use T-molding because I thought it was just too much of a pain in the ass and I don't really care. I didn't make the machine to impress anyone. So I just decided to route the edges just to make it smoother, and that was sort of the look I went for. And as you can see, moving forward, I sort of would just use bits of timber as like a bracing section, and then bolt other parts that I'd cut out onto on either side. So just sort of to try and make the whole structure, a bit solid. I'm looking at other YouTube videos and seeing how people do it, and just trying to, monkey see, monkey do kind of thing. So in terms of painting the box, I chose to use automotive 2-pack only because I've got a bit of experience spraying auto paint. I had the paint lying around. I had the respirator for it as well because it's extremely dangerous, and if you spray 2-pack without the proper safety equipment, you will die. Painting MDF is a bit of a pain. You've definitely got to give it a bit of a sand, and you've definitely got to prime it. The edges of MDF soak up paint like you wouldn't believe, so it's definitely worth priming all the edges and giving them a good sand back after the prime and that kind of thing, so that your top coat, whatever you choose to use, you can just use rattle cans if you want, enamel rattle cans or whatever you want to get from your hardware store. But yeah, just so happened that I had plenty of automotive paint. Stick the hardener in the colour and away I went. It's very durable and it's got a nice sort of glossy, shiny, strong finish to it. It's not perfect, I'm not an amazing painter, but yeah, come out respective for what I considered. Now moving to the control panel, what I ended up doing there was, first of all, the design that I put on the control panel I made in Photoshop, as well as the top bevel with the Tron sort of theme. So what I wanted to do was I printed out the template, and I laid that on the control panel, basically center punching the holes and then I used the 28mm drill bit and drilled the holes in the MDF on their own. And then, of course, to try and cover that control panel, because I wanted to protect the printout, like the nice design, I wanted to protect that with some acrylic. I ended up clamping the acrylic to the control panel after I drilled the MDF, and then I used what's called, like what we call in Australia, a Christmas tree drill bit, and just slowly increase the size of that hole to match the MDF. And that seemed to work quite well. I was quite happy with how it turned out. Yeah, so wiring the iPack, it's not terribly complicated. If you just Google wiring arcade micro switches, you'll see what you need to do. You just have a common that you'll connect all to a ground, and then just one signal out from each micro switch to each screw in the iPack, and it's all sort of defaulted. It'll tell you what button presses default out of the box for MAME, and that's pretty much it. And speaking of MAME, if you've lived under a rock for the last 15 years, you might not know what it is, but it's what you actually use to run on the PC, multiple arcade machine emulator or something like that. And it's basically an emulator that will run all of the ROMs, and a ROM is basically just all the information from the circuit that's come off the actual arcade machine. Someone has, some stage in the past, downloaded them from that chip and put them into software, so they're called a ROM. I'm not going to tell you how to get those ROM sets. You're just going to have to put your eye patch on and your peg leg and go hunting on the internet, if you know what I mean. A lot of people run front ends for MAME. And they're all these fancy UIs and all these like fancy lists and graphics and all this rubbish. I'm a bit more of a practical, functional type of person, so I wasn't really that keen with using a complicated front end that you have to spend hours and days and weeks setting up. So I just use MAME straight out of the box. I found that there's a list capability where you can just have favorites of your ROMs, and all of the going up and down the list, traversing the list and entering and exiting the games is all done by the arcade controls, so you don't need a keyboard of any kind or a mouse of any kind once it's set up. I ended up adding a pause and an exit button on my control panel. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, just shoot me a message in the comments, and it's time for a beer, I think.